Hi guys. So I wanted to start today's timeline with what we talked about in class, which was the sack of Lindisfarne in 793. And because of this, we can say that we had some Vikings, and we thought they were probably Norsemen. They enter our historical record by destroying the island monastery. All right? And we talked a little bit about how Charlemagne establishes a coast guard, and that was a centralized response to the Viking raids. Well, this centralized response is finished in the year 810, when Gorm the Old destroys the fortresses. Great. That should basically take us up to where we finished in class. Now, I would just point out to you that starting in 826, very slowly, is when the Northmen in Scandinavia begin to convert to Christianity. Now, in the year 839, we get a report that a group of people who the Byzantines call Rus have come near Constantinople. And we know that the Rus, well, actually, you know what Rus would mean in a Slavic language. The Rus are essentially blondies. So these blonde guys are spotted near Constantinople in 839. And we believe, and in fact are certain, that these Rus, in fact, are Swedes. So we do not know when these Swedes came out of Sweden and came down and made their way. But we know that by 839, there are already Swede people who are in this area. All right. So this is the first time that the Eastern Vikings enter the historical record. Now, by the year 844, we hear of Vikings attacking the Islamic city of Seville in Al-Andalus. And the big difference here is that the Islamic Emirate of Cordoba is able to have an effective response because that response is centralized. A navy is built to protect the coast, and really, when compared to how the rest of Western Europe is going to be affected by the Vikings, the Emirate of Cordoba is hardly affected at all. Even though longships are very effective, traveling across the North Sea is still dangerous. So it shouldn't surprise us that in the year 853, the Norse decide to spend the year in Dublin. This then, they move from just raiders to now moving in. These aren't just people who break in and steal the radio out of your car. Now they're stealing your car. All right? And this is around the same time that we think Vikings begin to enter the Mediterranean from the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar. All right? So the key thing about 853 then is that we are beginning to have the Vikings settle down. The Norse are not the first Vikings to settle down. Certainly that would have to have been the Rus, who by 839 are all the way down by Constantinople. But they are the first to settle down in Western Europe, outside of Scandinavia. Speaking of the Rus, by 865, the Rus are fighting against the Byzantines. All right? There's actually a battle. The Rus do not take over Constantinople, but this shows you how powerful the Rus are. Also, in this very same year, a man named Alfred becomes the King of England. All right? And I would like to connect Alfred with the idea of paying the Vikings not to attack you. This is a sort of semi-centralized response. It's not the same thing as creating a coast guard, but instead you just make a deal with, in this case probably the Danes, that's why we call it Danegeld, with the Danes. If we pay you, then you'll go home without hitting us in the face. It's a little bit like stealing somebody's lunch money without actually beating them up. So here we see that the external threat actually leads to centralization in England. This goes on okay, but still the Danes are raiding the English coast over and over and over again, until finally Alfred is able to simply create something called the Dane Law. And this is just a chunk of England that he gives over to the Danes. So, back to our map. If the Danes keep raiding across and across and across, fine, we'll just give them this part. And that's a little bit like the Roman concept of foederati. We'll give you the land so that you can protect it for us. And that is called the Peace of Wedmore. So that's another example of colonization. Just a few years later, we learn of a Rus man, whose name was Oleg, establishing a capital in Kiev. And he establishes a kingdom called Kievian Russia. Now, again, if we look at our map, we'll see that makes a lot of sense, because Kiev has river access both up to the north and down along the Dnieper to the Black Sea and to the great capital.